Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. About every 4 weeks, a new edition of APDR comes out which overlaps with a podcast, and this is the case now. So there'll be a bit of duplication, but please go and look at the magazine. It's free. The more views we get, the better. Now, in it, I wrote about several troublesome areas for defence, including nuclear submarines, AUKUS Pillar 1, the unfolding disaster of general-purpose frigates. I provided a lot of information about what I believe is the huge mistake the Air Force made in not considering the Embraer C390 as the replacement for C-130Js. I also touched on a couple of recently released reports damaging to defence. There was an ANAO study that details more than a decade of mishandling and mismanagement of a $1 billion munitions contract with Thales. That's got a bit of coverage in the broader media. Also, the Joint Committee into Public Accounts and Audit released the final report into the Hunter-class frigate selection process, and it doesn't make pretty reading, with missing documentation and completely inexplicably no value for money assessment. As I've said before, this is unprecedented and is a lapse that has never occurred before in a major or minor defence purchase. It's a fundamental principle underlying all Commonwealth purchases, not just defence. Anyway, to this dismal list, we can add earlier things, like the secret attempt to destroy and bury the entire Taipan helicopter fleet, and I'm not done with this story at all. It remains the single most idiotic, appalling, unjustified defence decision I've seen, which is saying a lot, followed closely by this gift of about $10 billion we are in the process of making to US and UK submarine building companies. There's also the complete mishandling of the Arafura OPV project, about which I'll say more in a moment, and the erosion of Navy's critical mine warfare capabilities. What else? There's the ongoing resistance inside defence to supplying Ukraine with meaningful military aid. Aid, I should point out, that could and should be things that the ADF no longer wants, such as Taipan helicopters and RBS-70 low-level air defence systems. Look, it's a long list. What else? And you'll understand why I'm going through all of this in a moment. We have, yes, the ongoing recruitment disaster, with the ADF actually having fewer people than 10 years ago. And people in the defence system seem to be struggling to understand why. Well, here's a hint. Your obsessive secrecy leads to stupid decisions, and that culture repels intelligent young people. Now, the point of all of this is the weekend before last, Defence Minister Richard Marles was asked on Insiders if there were problems with defence procurement. And astonishingly, he said, in his opinion, it was fine. Well, just referring to the above list, I think it's apparent to everyone it is not all fine. What should also concern people is the amount of misinformation being released to the public on defence topics. I can't say it's deliberate. That would imply motivation, but at the very least, it's both careless and harmful. I'll give a couple of recent examples from Senate estimates. Defence officials said that it is impossible for a new ship to be in the water by 2029 that contains both the Saab 9LV combat management systems and CEA radars, both produced in Australia. I think this is flat out wrong, and no information whatsoever has been supplied to back up those misleading claims. I think it's just another assumption that probably originated from the ex-USN advisors that have now thoroughly infiltrated the defence decision-making process. And I note that one of the likely contenders, a Thai frigate of 3,700 tons built by Korea's Hanwha Ocean, already has 9LV installed. The entire combat management system, including consoles, was made in Adelaide. So it's already there. You don't have to worry about 2029. Regardless of that, Defence maintain that this is impossible to do. I just don't get it. Now, regarding another one of my hobby horses, the Arafura offshore patrol vessels, and I'm going to quote from Chief of Navy Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, who said, and now I'm quoting from my own story in APDR, he says, "The unit cost of this project has increased above the original expectations, and the DSR process illuminated the fact that our constabulary vessel, which is the OPV, will have limited utility in combat operations. We've examined opportunities to upgrade it with respect to embarking additional lethality missile systems, etc. It was never designed for that, so in that context I agree with the assessment that it is not fit for purpose for those combat operations." Now, when the Chief of Navy says it was never designed for that, that seems just plain wrong. In 2014, the Royal Brunei Navy took two of their ships, this is the parent Darussalam class, to RIMPAC. They participated in SYNC-X, simultaneously firing an exocet from each ship from widely different directions. Both missiles struck the target at the same moment, demonstrating, one would have thought, a great deal of combat effectiveness. Now, in the Australian context, the exocets could be replaced with the Kongsberg Naval Strike Missile. There's plenty of deck space available for those, and NSMs weigh less than the exocets that the ships are designed to carry. They are extremely effective surface-to-surface missiles, which is why they've been ordered by several nations, including the US and Japan. Now, we can also assure readers that the Arafura class have all the necessary deck strengthening still in place, so a 57mm main gun could be easily installed. It was left there because the RAN originally planned to fit a 40mm system, firstly from Bofors and then Leonardo, but they forgot to tell the manufacturer about their certification requirements, and so the contract was cancelled. So for the Chief of Navy to say that the ships have no utility at all in combat operations overlooks the fact that the parent class carry surface missiles and a variety of weapons. Now, let's turn to the big question of why this is happening. I don't see any point with the head-in-the-sand idea that defence is functioning normally when, as I've related, there are so many examples where things are going adrift. I think that there are probably three fundamental issues. I've touched on these before. Lack of internal contestability within defence combined with just appalling levels of groupthink, then political interference in procurements that make the situation worse, not better. Now, there's nothing wrong with the occasional ministerial intervention when it's necessary. That's why they are paid, but it shouldn't be constant. And finally, there's the quality of the ministers themselves and their staff. Now, I've had a few harsh words to say about Defence Minister Richard Marles in the past, and I'll say, first of all, he's a genuinely nice person and people instinctively like him. But I can't get over this weird insistence that he be called the Deputy Prime Minister. I think it's an indication of where his true priorities are. And I could say a lot more about this, but I'm not here to humiliate people, so I'm not going to go into those. But it does seem to indicate, as I say, that defence is not really at the forefront of his thinking. And I wonder about how truly objectively stupid ideas, such as destroying and burying $1 billion worth of perfectly good Taipan helicopters, somehow gained almost instantaneous ministerial approval. I would have thought common sense would have dictated a completely different outcome. Now, if I had been told about the problems of poor availability, rather than destroy the fleet, I would have instructed Army to fix it. And since it seems they are incapable of doing that, yes, efforts have been made in the past, I would have called for an independent review from a big logistics company, such as KBR, or maybe even an airline. They know a thing or two about keeping platforms airborne, or maybe ask the RAAF for their view. But again, because these decisions are being taken by small numbers of people without any external frame of reference and without any internal criticism, this sort of crazy stuff keeps happening. Now, another is the uncritical acceptance of the idea that we will pay billions of dollars for second-hand Virginia-class submarines. Now, who came up with that dumb idea? I'm going to quote Chief of Navy again. This is, again, Senate estimates, public domain stuff, transcripts available. He says, I don't have an appetite to take on additional platforms that are only going to cost more to sustain as they get older. The reality with the cost of ownership of warships is there's a slight premium at the beginning. When you settle them into service and iron out any issues, then that cost of ownership stabilizes through life. Then as they get older, the cost of ownership increases, particularly as you're dealing with obsolescence issues and more frequent repair issues. I favour operating a newer surface combatant force sooner rather than later. I think that's the best outcome for the taxpayer. Now, that was the end of the quote, and as the last sentence would indicate, he's actually talking about surface ships, but submarines, if anything, are even more maintenance intensive. Now, I can reveal the reality. Australia was so desperate to acquire these things, nuclear-powered submarines, that our officials were prepared to take anything, and since then they have tried to make a virtue out of the fact that we will be getting submarines, if they arrive, that are halfway through their lives. The reality is that at a formative stage in this AUKUS process, a couple of powerful US senators said, no way to brand new submarines for Australia. Tell the Australians it's second-hand or nothing. I sometimes wonder, as I mentioned in one of my earlier podcasts as a joke, why, if second-hand submarines are such a brilliant idea, why we don't insist on ones that are even older. Now, this is unlikely to have occurred in previous times of defence procurement, and now I'm going to try and lighten the mood by telling an anecdote, and I'm doing this with the agreement of Kim Beazley, the former Defence Minister. And he says while he cannot remember all of the details, he's said he's happy to go along with my recollection. I was chatting with him a few weeks ago and ran this past him. And I think this is going back to 1985 or 1986 when Kim was a new and young Defence Minister and I had just started in journalism. The RAN decided to impress the new minister with a naval air defence exercise. Now, this was not long after the Falklands War, and there was a great deal of talk about the dangers of anti-ship missiles such as Exocet. We were helicoptered onto a big supply ship, HMAS Success, I assume. And by the way, isn't it quaint that the Navy still has the belief that the biggest ship in the fleet is automatically the flagship? That's the same, by the way, as the UK and Spain, I think, and which was fine in the 18th century when the biggest thing carried the most guns and therefore was the most powerful. But surely it's completely out of place in the 21st century when the biggest thing is sometimes an enormous, slow-moving, floating target unable to defend itself. Anyway, the scenario was there was going to be an F-111 coming in to conduct the attack, accompanied by 4 Macchi trainer jets, and the trainers were going to simulate 4 Exocet missiles. That they were coming in with the F-111, they're going to pretend to be launched, and then they're going to fly the attack profile of Exocets. Now, there are a few strange things about this, including the fleet, such as it was. We were sailing on serenely, slowly and steadily in one direction. No thought of evasive manoeuvres or anything like that. We knew approximately when it was going to happen, and we knew exactly from which direction, west as it was. But when suddenly it did happen, the RAN was completely overwhelmed. In just seconds, Macchies were flying all over the joint. with two of them heading, climbing and then diving straight for us, and another two heading for the escort ships. And as a final insult, I think, the F-111 pilot really hit the gas, and at just a fraction under the speed of sound, cleared the bridge by about 50 metres. It was all over in a couple of seconds, and the RAN seemed to have demonstrated very convincingly how vulnerable they were to exactly this sort of attack. Anyway, after the noise subsided, a few seconds later there was kind of a shocked silence on the bridge until a very distinctive voice said loudly, "We're totally effed." As I say, Kim can't recall using those precise words, but he says he's happy with that anecdote because that's in fact what he's likely to have said, and he's used those words and plenty of similar ones on other occasions. Now, fast forward today. I have little doubt that ministers would be nodding along with approval with what Navy had demonstrated, having been told in advance that it was some sort of air defence exercise. Would be, "Good show, Admiral, excellent demonstration. Can we buy more used submarines? Do you have any helicopters we can destroy and bury? You don't want to be left behind by the army, do you?" What we're talking about, sadly, is a complete absence of common sense. Let's circle back to the big question of why this is happening, and I suspect a lot of it has to do with individual and small group psychology. There are plenty of terms to explore, such as inherent bias and cognitive dissonance, but basically it's people often believe what they want to believe, and having convinced themselves of something, it's difficult to get them to change their views. The most usual example given by psychologists are fanatical supporters of a sporting team who become so attached that they lose their objectivity. And we all know these sorts of people. Their team is always right. If a penalty is awarded, it must be the fault of the ref or the other lot are cheating, that sort of thing. Now, personally, I've never possessed that particular gene, but a lot of people have it. Now, this is, in my opinion, exactly what is being played out in AUKUS Pillar 1. And it's what the head of the Australian Submarine Agency, Vice Admiral Jonathan Meade, so amply demonstrated at Senate estimates. I made this the theme of a previous podcast, so I won't repeat everything. What is being played out is the insistence that the US is committed to supplying us with second-hand Virginia subs, and this commitment means it will happen. This is why a refund clause for our $4.7 billion is presumably unnecessary. But we need to look at these things objectively, not emotionally. Yeah, humans are emotional, that's why we're humans and not robots, and we get enthusiastic about things. Nothing wrong with a bit of enthusiasm. However, when it comes to defence decisions, especially as huge as AUKUS, we need to consider the possibility of failure, even if that possibility is only 10%. Of course, the agreement between Australia and the US, whatever it is, I suspect notes on the back of a beer coaster, should have a refund clause. There's no good reason why it was left out, other than some sort of ridiculous, slavish devotion to the US, some sort of misguided idea, oh, if we put in a refund clause, the US will think we don't trust them. No, actually, it's just called prudent planning. By the way, I'm halfway through a very new book called, this is the title, Nuked, The Submarine Fiasco That Sunk Australia's Sovereignty by Andrew Fowler. It has a lot of information about the stupidity and political manipulation behind AUKUS Pillar 1. It should be required reading for Richard Marles, Vice Admiral Meade and all of the others, but I bet they won't, because it would disturb their view that their team is always right and always deserves to win. That's all I've got time for today. There will be a lot more in the next podcast. Thank you for listening. Bye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.